Hello, friends. Welcome to another conversation. This is going to be important if you are someone who grew up religious at all and have questions about how God might or might not be working in society right now, given all that's going on culturally and politically, and maybe like what you were told about God and how God is either ordaining or not ordaining everything that you're seeing today. So what I'm doing in this episode is I want to bring on two friends of mine. Actually, one I've had on the podcast many times. One, it's his first time, but they are open and relational theologians. This is a very different way of thinking about God and God's power, or we might say God's sovereignty or God's rule, and how God functions with humanity. So, bringing in on the show today, I have Jeff Wells over here to my right. I have Tom Oord to my left. Both of them are open and relational theologians. Gentlemen, good to have you. Thanks for making time.
Thanks so
Great
much.
to be with you.
Absolutely. Jeff, let's start with you. Just give the audience a very brief introduction, who you are and what you do.
So, I am the lead pastor at Church of the Village, which is located in Greenwich Village in Manhattan. It is a medium-sized congregation in which we put into practice the ideas of open and relational theology.
Awesome. And Tom, go ahead.
I'm a theologian, I'm a writer, speaker, and photographer.
Okay, awesome. Photographer, had to put that in there.
That's right.
Tom, why don't we have you kind of kick us off? Just give us the thesis statement of open and relational theology, or what it means to be an open and relational theologian. This is not a very common phrase. I mean, I grew up in evangelicalism my whole life, never heard the term ever, and then I discovered even in progressive spaces, it's not a super commonly understood term either. It seems like you and some other people are kind of pioneering some new ground here. So go ahead and give us how you break down this term and what it means.
The relational and open and relational means that God is directly involved in our lives, not only giving, but also receiving, being affected by what we in creation does. The open word means that God is moving with us through time, such that God doesn't predestine the future. In fact, God doesn't even know with certainty what's going to happen in the future. But God moves through time moment by moment with us. And that makes a big difference in a lot of doctrines. I think two of the big issues for this conversation that will be relevant is that open and relational folks don't have a God who's in control of everything. They rethink a traditional view of God's power. And secondly, open and relational folks emphasize the issues of love, not only in terms of us loving one another, but that God is a lover who gives and receives and doesn't control.
Well, I'm just gonna say that that sounds, dare I use the phrase, unorthodox as far as how we understand God. So what I'm hearing you say is that in your view, God is almost like dancing with us in real time. And based on how we're moving and how God is moving, things are happening. But God does not know exactly what the next step is going to be in the dance because we're working with God to make this thing happen. Is that like a fair
That's a
characterization of what you
great,
just said?
yeah. Yeah, and
Okay.
to use your dancing, take your dancing illustration one more time, or one step further. Not only is God a dancer who doesn't know exactly where everything's going to go, but God's dancing is always persuasive, always wooing, always toward the good. God, we can trust God to never break bad.
We can trust God to never break bad. Okay.
In
Interesting.
other words, some
Yeah.
people worry that maybe if God doesn't know the future or isn't in control, then maybe God will turn from being loving to, kicking your butt from time to time or doing some
Right.
evil or get so upset with things that God's going to wrathfully throw lightning bolts down. And we reject that view.
Okay. Jeff, what do you think? Anything you want to add to that definition or understanding?
Uh, I think that Tom would also say, and Tom has written so much about this, that the fundamental characteristic of God is love.
Yeah.
And so God works not through coercion, but through persuasion and inspiration and beckoning us in different directions and offering us in every single moment the best possibilities for that moment and going into the next. So the future is, so we respond to those calls from God, and therefore we're through our responses and our relationship with God, we're co-creating the future. It
Okay.
doesn't already exist. So that
Yeah.
so there's
Yeah.
no such thing as predestination in open and relational theology, because God doesn't know the future and doesn't dictate what happens, but God is trying to lure not just human beings, but every creature and even other kinds of living systems into the best possible future.
Yeah, so when I grew up in conservative evangelical Christianity, I was kind of given two different options, right? I was given a view of what was known as Calvinism, right, which is that, hey, God sovereignly predestined you to either go to heaven or to, they wouldn't say hell, even though it really was, but what they would say is that God would leave you in your sin to your own devices. And the natural outflowing of that was you would endure God's wrath forever. The other option I was given was Arminianism, which is that no, we have a choice, but God is still all powerful and still knows the outcome, but you still have a choice. And it sounds like what you both are saying is that no, God indeed does not know the outcome ultimately of what's going to happen next. We are working with God to create that. Now God, and I'm trying to summarize this for the audience and tell me if I miss any of this, but God is always aimed and oriented towards love, mercy, justice, goodness. Maybe we could say like the fruit of the Spirit, right? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness. God is always pushing us there. And we have the option, maybe we can say moment by moment, to participate in dancing towards that, or we can try and pull in a direction that ends up bringing chaos and disorder and harm to God's good creation. But God doesn't know which way we're going to go, even though they're attempting to woo us towards a certain direction of love. How'd I do?
I love it. I
That's
love it.
very,
I think the
very
only
good.
word I would change in that, Tim, is
Tell me.
probably you realize this as well. You said God is pushing us toward those things. I think Jeff used the word beckoning us or calling
Mm,
us.
mm.
So I want to
Right.
make sure folks don't think that this is a God who, is forcing us to do things. That's not the view we hold.
Okay. Yeah, Jeff, go
More
ahead.
like pulling us instead of
Pulling
pushing
us.
us.
Ah, there
Uh,
you go.
but
Mm,
and the problem with classical Christian theology is that even Arminianism that says that we have the freedom to choose, if it says that God is still all powerful, then they have to go through all kinds of contortions to say how that works, how we have freedom but God is still all powerful and
mm.
can do anything. Then if God's all powerful, why doesn't God simply stop all suffering and evil in the world? Or why does God let people have cancer? Does God is God evil in that sense because God allows that? So open and relational theology solves that problem of theodicy, or the problem of evil in classical Christian theology by saying God can't simply intervene and make things happen or not happen, but God is accompanying us every moment. So that's different too than most classical representations of God that say God intervenes here and there occasionally, but otherwise is sort of overseeing and watching what's going on. And that, I think we would say that God, as you put it, Tim, God is there every single moment.
Yeah, can I illustrate this, Tim?
Please do, Tom.
I think a lot of people look at the Trump presidency, not only the
Mm,
past one, but the recent one, and say to themselves, isn't God a good God? Why would God put Donald Trump in power? Or they'll say, why did God allow people to vote for Donald Trump? Because in either perspective, whether God caused the election or allowed it, ultimately, God has final say if God is omnipotent. But we in the open and relational community, we don't look at it like that. We don't think God caused Trump to be president or even allowed it as if God could have stopped it. We think God called every single voter to vote for the best. And at least in my opinion, they didn't choose wisely. They
Mm.
didn't vote
right.
for the best. And now we're stuck with a president that I don't think God wanted.
You said the word omnipotent. Can you just break that down? What that means for people out there?
Yeah, it's a kind of a slippery word, but it usually either means one of three things. Either God controls absolutely everything, or God could do anything God wants to do, Or, and this is where some open relational folks differ, they'll
Okay.
say God can control some people sometimes, but usually doesn't. I think Jeff and I are both in the camp that says God simply can't control anyone or anything at any time because God's love is inherently uncontrolling and God loves everyone and everything.
Okay. I have to pick up. I have to pick up on a few threads here, and I do want to bring this to a real grounded experience currently, what we're living through in 2025. So we are going to get into the tangible outcomes of this, right? But you keep saying what you're not saying, Tom, is that God won't control people. You're saying God can't control
Right.
people. So the difference is me saying I can't lift that car over my head, or I won't lift the car over my head, right? One
Right.
implies that I could, but I'm choosing not to. The other says, doesn't matter how hard I try, it's just not possible. Are you saying that in this view of open and relational theology, God does not have the power, cannot control other people, not that they're choosing not to?
I'm saying that's what Jeff and I would say. Now,
Yeah.
there's a variety of open relation, but Jeff and I would say God simply can't. Not because God is up on Mars looking down at us and saying, I'm not going to get involved down there. I could, but I'm not choosing not to. Or not because God is present to us and permitting the crap that happens. We're saying that God simply can't because it's God's nature not to control. It
Hmm.
doesn't mean God's a wimp. It doesn't mean God is inactive. I think God's the most powerful being and force in the universe, but God's power is always uncontrolling.
What do you think about that, Jeff?
Yeah, I think that I would add to that for me, the basis of that is that God is love.
Yeah.
And I think we know that not just because the Bible says it, but because that's our experience. If we really are connecting with God in a deep spiritual way, we know that God is love, and love is inherently non-coercive.
Hmm.
So it makes God all loving and powerfully persuasive, but not coercive.
So look, on one hand, this does solve a problem that I think a lot of us growing up in evangelicalism in particular have wrestled with, right? Because I grew up hearing people like R.C. Sproul say that every molecule in the universe is subservient to God. Like God is or he I think it's John Piper who says at one point he woke up in his bedroom and saw dust particles hitting the sun and thought to himself, wow, God is controlling every single dust particle and how it falls, right? Like this kind of like hyper controlling, nothing is outside of God's will, which of course leads you to all kinds of problematic ideas like, well, if someone is sexually assaulted, is that decreed by God? And John Piper would say yes, but the benefit is that it's for God's mysterious purpose, which you'll find out one day in the afterlife, which doesn't really answer the question at all. And this is, I'm not strawmanning John. He's said this before on the air. The other view that I grew up hearing was, well, no, like we have free choice. We have agency to make decisions, but God is all powerful. And God simply permits these things to happen because God is love and God can allow, us to make choices even if they hurt others. Which, of course, when you get to things like children with cancer, which no one caused, it just happened. You wonder, well, why would God allow that to happen? Like, it's not. He's not stopping anyone's agency, right? Or they, whatever. God is simply allowing a child to get cancer and to pass away early, causing untold amounts of damage and suffering to both the child and the parents. That doesn't make much sense either. And so this view tends to kind of answer that differently by saying, well, what if God can't? What if God can't? And what if God is relying on us to partner with God to make the best possible world moment by moment that we can, aimed and oriented at love? Maybe we could say things like human flourishing, that kind of idea. Is that a fair kind of, would you say that all three of those perspectives are kind of accurate in how I describe them for you guys?
Yep.
I would. Yeah, I like it. I would put a fourth one on there that's
Go
not
for it.
really a model of God, but it's the one I hear a lot of liberal Christians appeal to.
Oh, we're going
Not,
after the liberals? I love that, Tom.
yeah,
Okay,
that's
yeah,
right.
let's do it.
A lot of liberal Christians see the problem with saying God caused it all. So the John Piper view.
Yeah.
And then they see the problem with saying God doesn't cause it all, but God allows it because God wants free will. Because if God allows your sister's rape, that's not a loving thing, or the pandemic or cancer for a child. That doesn't make a lot of sense. And so they see those two options and they say, well, I don't have a good answer. So mystery.
Mm.
God is a mystery. If
Mm.
you face unnecessary suffering, pointless pain, genuine evil, in some mysterious way, something's going on, but we don't know, big mystery card. We're offering an actual solution, an answer, not playing the mystery card, but we're doing so by beginning with a God of persuasive, uncontrolling love and saying, if you start here, then you can overcome these two bad options. Don't have to just play the heck if I know mystery card and have an actual proposal on the table that solves the biggest reason why many people can't believe in God.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Look, it seems like the problem I see though with this other view is the obvious elephant in the room. Like, well, then God is not all powerful. Then so what is, who is, how is God, right? Because I have a hard time parsing out this concept of like, okay, I'm with you both, by the way. Like the idea that God is decreeing everything that we see around us, it falls apart on every level, right? And even the people who inhale that theology, someone like Ali Stuckey, for example, who would say that God's always on the throne. Well, she fights like hell whenever a Democrat is in office. So if God's on the throne and God decreed Joe Biden to be president, why are you fighting? What is
Yeah,
God's
right.
clear will, right? So I'm not disputing that at all. I mean, to me, that's ridiculous. But this view, which by the way, putting my cards out on the table, I'm very attracted to this view of God for a lot of reasons. So I'm in your corner on this, as far as I can understand it, to be fair. But it does make me always ask the question, like, well, then what is God, or who is God, and how powerful is this God? And are we all just helpless then, ultimately? Because what humans as we know them in their current form have not been around that long, and we've done a lot of damage. We kill each other often. We commit what we could say is hell on earth often. Throughout every type of society and different ages. I mean, there's a human history legacy here of violence, right? And so I'm just wondering, like, for me, something that does give me hope is that one day the crooked of the world will be made straight again, right? Like all the brokenness will be made whole because God is going to reconcile all things back to themselves. But this version of God, that doesn't seem like a real option. It just seems like, well, maybe one day, 10,000 years from now, whenever humans get more evolved, they'll finally partner with God enough to stop human suffering. And that doesn't really answer my question in the here and now either. So I would like either one of you, Tom or Jeff or both, to take a stab at that thesis, and I want to hear what you have to say.
You want to start, Jeff?
So, yeah. So, on whether or not humans have 10,000 years to evolve, I have serious doubts, given what we've done to the planet, and
That's
are
fair.
continuing to do. So, but I think that often people look at this understanding of God, and say, well, doesn't that mean that God is weak? But to say that is to say that love itself is weak. And I don't think love is weak. I think love is the strongest power in the universe, but it doesn't necessarily overcome every instance of evil and suffering. And yeah, I'll just stop there and
Yeah, I
hand
think
it over to Tom.
I like that, Jeff. I want to jump in with an illustration. Suppose you're a person who lives, let's say, 300 years ago, and you're told that by definition, you live on a flat earth. That is what earth is. It's flat. It's not round. It's flat. That by definition, to live on this, they wouldn't say planet, but I'll use the word planet now. To live on this place, this
Right.
planet is to
Yeah.
be a flat. And then someone comes along and says, "Oh, hold on a second. This is not making sense because of certain things we're noticing about the curvature of the earth, or, the stars and the rotations. It turns out the earth is round." Now, do you come up to that person and say, "Well, hold on a second. I was told it was flat. I can't redefine the word earth or planet in any way other than flat, even if you give me overwhelming evidence and reasons why I should? Or do you say to yourself, well, I'm going to still use that word earth, but I'm going to say evidence seems to support that it's round instead of flat?
Mm.
Analogously, most people have said God is all powerful, omnipotent, can do anything, either controls everything or could control, occasionally controls. And we're saying, yeah, we actually want to keep that word God, but we think the evidence points in a different direction. That
Mm.
God isn't omnipotent, isn't controlling. And in fact, we can pull from our most important resources, the resources of love that we find highlighted in Scripture and see in our own intuitions in life, and say, if we begin with this way of thinking, we'll keep the God word and still move on for a better overall explanation of things.
Okay, so let's move this into some like real world scenarios, right? And listen, you two are mature enough to understand this, but just so the audience knows, yes, we know that we're three white men on this podcast talking about God and different ways of handling evil, a lot of which does not affect us, especially in our current political climate, right? So we acknowledge that 100%, and we know that our own privilege and bias can play a role in how we see the world. I mean, it's fair to acknowledge. So I think that that's important to mention. So as we're talking about these things, we both know that like what the Trump regime is doing and what they're aiming to do doesn't really target people like us, right? It targets our trans neighbors, it targets our black neighbors, our gay neighbors, etc., right? Our most marginalized neighbors. And so I'm wondering, look, a lot of people in my audience and in our community are like, they're freaking out. And I'm one of them. I mean, I was trying to raise the alarm bell. If you follow us on YouTube or podcasts or social media, all of 2024 was like full court press on Christian nationalism. What's going on? What's animating it? What is Project 2025? We were trying to raise the alarm that, hey, there are some pretty militant fundamentalist Christians who are really excited about the possibility of Trump taking power, because if he gets power, he will give them what they want. And we're seeing that, right? We have Pete Hegseth now being confirmed in the cabinet as the Secretary of Defense, someone who lives off of and breathes Doug Wilson theology, which is borderline slavery apologist theology. I mean, this is dark stuff. A man who has crusader imagery, iconography tattooed on him. I can go down the list. You all know this. And so I don't like the answer, and I saw some people do this, right? Like Ali Suckies. I use her often because she's a good example of this, but many others, Charlie Kirk, many Christian nationalist types, God is so good. God's grace. I mean, literally, I'm not sure if you both saw this, but Charlie Kirk was talking to Eric Metaxas, and they both agreed that Trump's second presidency, him winning the office, was a bigger sign of God's grace than what happened during World War II when we liberated, Holocaust survivors. Okay, I'm not kidding you. That's how they're framing this. God's hands on Trump. God is saving the country again. That kind of language. And I look at this and I go, whoa! Like, what God are you serving that like put this man into office that is targeting people based on propaganda, our immigrant neighbor, our trans neighbor, etc. So when you look, and either of you can take this, maybe Jeff, we can start with you because you're a pastor kind of in the trenches trying to help shepherd people in a local church. How do you talk to your congregation, Jeff, about how God is moving in the world with humans right now, given all that's going on?
Well, since we've already been teaching to the congregation over many years that God is not able to simply control everything, they're not looking at this with a lot of questions about why is God allowing this to happen or why is God causing this to happen. So I don't think that there's anyone in the congregation who's saying, "Oh, why did God put Trump in power?" However, what we are doing, because people are afraid, and it isn't just people who are directly being targeted. People know that this is going to have an impact on everybody except the billionaires, right? It's going to have a huge impact on the economy, on jobs, on all kinds of things.
Right.
And we do have a very diverse congregation that's very heavily LGBTQ and Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, and so there is a lot of fear around what's happening and confusion. But what we're encouraging people to do is to hold on to the reality that we know that God is accompanying us through all of this, and God is trying to work in all of the ways that God can to move things in a better direction. Obviously, that isn't going to be immediate. And so in the immediate time, while we're offering whatever resistance we can to what's happening, we also have to draw upon God and upon one another for strength and resilience, and still hold on to those moments when we can have experiences of joy and love and laughter and community with one another as we're going through all of this.
Tom, before you respond, I did find the clip as you guys were talking of Charlie Kirk and Eric Metaxas talking about the election of Donald Trump. Listen to this, and then let's get your thoughts on this, Tom.
I do believe that we're living through one of God's greatest graces upon the Republic since its founding.
Oh, there's absolutely no doubt. I mean, I'm tracking 100. I've been saying the same thing. We're living through tremendous history this minute.
And I think God gave his grace at its founding. God gave his grace in the Civil War. God gave his grace in World War II. And I think that this is up there. Because where we were headed, it would have...
Honestly, this is ahead of World War II.
This is ahead of World War II. I mean, Tom, you hear this, right? You're looking at two men who advocate for just some heinous policies, a person who it was found liable of sexually assaulting a woman, a man who lies through his teeth. Really, frankly, a man who embodies none of the Christianity I was taught as a conservative white evangelical. I mean, that's how low the bar is, right? And here they are saying that Trump's presidency or his win was a bigger portion of God's grace than what happened in World War II. When you hear that, Tom, like, what do you think? And listen, both of you are very reserved people. I need some spice here, okay? I need to know, Tom, that you're pissed off about this shit and that you're mad. I got to hear it. So fire away.
I do get mad. I do get pissed off. I tell you, though, I want to address that first. I'm trying to figure out how to live my life such that I don't get overly emotional about these things. I mean, it's natural to be pissed off when people say stuff like this, but I don't want to live the next 4 years of my life in a state that's unhelpful to me and others. I want to be able to have some sort of self-regulation of my emotions while expressing them in appropriate ways when I am pissed off. But I think what this clip illustrates nicely is that Christians can use the same words and mean very different things. What they mean by God's grace sounds, from what I know of them in history and etc., something like God's grace is God's authority that puts certain people in power, usually white guys, have certain roles for women, etc., etc. Their view of God's grace is linked to a particular view of God and God's authority in the world. When I use the word grace, I mean something very different. And there's two words that I've come to think characterize these two notions of grace. The one we saw in the clip, I think, is overpowering grace. It's the idea that God is in control and has authority, and we ought to be aligned with that authority. And there's sort of a chain of command with God at the top, men, not far below, women further, down the line. And so that is an overpowering kind of grace. Where we in the open and relational community, we believe in empowering grace. The notion that God's love gives away power and enables or empowers others to respond in their particularities so that everyone has a voice and contributes, not in a grand hierarchical cause of being, but as in a democratic, open dialogue in which the best ideas and the most persuasive visions can rise to the top rather than a few overpowering and determining what's going to be done. So that's two different ways of thinking about grace that I think are nicely illustrated in this particular thing. But can I also say one more thing about your comment about us being three white guys, Tim?
Fire away.
I'm really happy you said that, because I do think that the kind of vision that Jeff and I are laying out is a vision that says everybody's voice matters, and we need to include everyone because, we shouldn't privilege white guys over others. However, I want to compliment you, Tim. I think
Me?
there's also,
Oh
yes,
goodness.
you, because I don't
I
watch
didn't pay him
everything
to
you
say
do.
this, folks. Whatever he's going to say,
Nope,
did not
nope,
pay him.
this is coming out
Okay.
of left field. I don't watch everything you do, but I do watch some. And I am so thankful for your standing up to injustice and acting for the ways of love as a white guy. Because I think many people today, implicitly or explicitly, endorse what I like to call a politics of self interest.
Hmm.
And that politics of self interest says whatever is right for me is what I have to always defend. And if I happen to be a white guy, then I'm going to defend everything that white guys need. If I happen to be a black woman, I'm going to defend. If I happen to be queer, I'm going to defend whatever queerness helps me. And in that way of thinking, and I think actually many in the Trump realm have this view of politics of self interest, they can easily dismiss the queer person, the black person, the woman as saying, well, the reason they don't like our policies is that they're just looking out for their own self interest. And, we're the white guys. We have to look out for our self interest. And so they can dismiss the queer voice, the woman, the person of color. But then when three white guys, and you in particular, Tim, come along and say, hold on a second, your policies are bad. They're wrong. They don't reveal love. And I'm saying that as a white guy. And it's maybe even against my own self interest to say it. But I'm saying it because I care about the whole, the common good, the democratic lifting of all voices. So, Tim, thanks for your witness. And I just want to say there's a role for white guys like the three of us standing up to Trump.
100%. In fact, I thanks for saying that. And Jeff, I'll give it to you in 1 second. I just wanted to respond to that briefly. Yeah, I'm really with you in a lot of this. And it's been really great being in different spaces that are not full of white men, hearing other voices and how they think about this. It's been such a learn for me to think about how I hear often from black women. I care about my queer neighbor and their rights. That's why we're in solidarity together, right?
Right.
And I found kind of the same thing where it's like, and I've said this before publicly, I want my MAGA neighbor and their children to have affordable health care. I want them to have access to affordable education. I want them to have access to livable wages, right? Like, we really want our whole society to be able to flourish. And I do think, Tom, that you're right. I mean, the reason why I mentioned the white guy thing, just to be really clear and transparent with you, is because sometimes people can assume that, and rightfully so, that white guys don't see like what this looks like. And I'm trying to say, I see it. I totally do. And also, as one of my good friends, a dear friend who I respect so much, I was talking to her a long time ago. I'm like, I was struggling with like my privilege. I was kind of realizing for the first time how my body operates in the world versus how my black neighbor's body operates in the world and how it's just so different. And I was like, I'm not sure what to do. I can't control how I was born or what I look like. And she's like, just use your privilege for good. Just use it for good. I'm like, you know what? That I can do. And I really think that white men in particular have a major obligation to stand up and say these parts out loud, because the arrows are not directly aimed at us. And we can take the shots, and we should take the shots, because we have to stand up to other white men like Charlie and Eric and say, no, like, this is absolutely bad. This is bananas. Like, your view here is absolutely crazy and is hurting people. So I just think it's important for people, white men, to be able to say the quiet parts out loud and say, no, we see it, we recognize it, we want to stand in solidarity and use whatever tools we have at our disposal to be part of the larger conversation to help push things forward, right? Go ahead, Jeff.
And that's part of why I feel so privileged and honored to be serving as the pastor of the Church of the Village, which is a very diverse congregation and identifies itself as radically inclusive and anti-racist. Explicitly, it says anti-racist under the logo. And I think that's very unusual. And I want to say about what Tom said earlier, that taking this stand is not just intellectual, right? And for Tom in particular, he just got kicked out of his denomination for taking a stand in support of LGBTQ inclusion. So,
no, I'm with you.
It's a risk, right? It's a risk to take these stands and to struggle for these ideas. But I think that it's so important it's I think that, you know, I it pains me to have to say this, because I don't like the idea of saying that somebody else who claims to be Christian is not Christian.
Yeah.
But the reality is that Christian nationalism does not follow the teachings of Jesus.
Right.
Right.
Right. 100%.
And the other thing that to get back to what we were talking about, open and relational theology actually is aligned better with what's in the Bible than classical Christian theology is.
Mm-hmm.
Because the God that we find in the Bible is not all powerful. The God we find in the Bible changes God's mind, and a number of other things that I'm sure we could elaborate on if we had time.
Okay, yeah, I mean that's helpful. And yeah, I mean that's a good point about Tom. I mean, and look, I you guys have, well, Tom, you followed my work for a while, and you know that in the beginning, it was a lot of theology. A lot of our podcast episodes were like, how do we think about all these different theological topics? Heaven, hell, salvation, the Bible, this. And frankly, I'm still so fascinated by those questions. I'm still reading about them. I love talking to you, Tom. It's just so much fun. But I got to a point, maybe like early last year, where I said, this is all useless if it's not being practiced and helping people, right? Because my neighbor in inner city Philly, they don't give a crap if I believe in Calvinism or Arminianism or open and relational. They don't care, right? They care about how am I working for a better society that helps them. And so I love these talks because they're a lot of fun and they're helpful. And I do think that theology matters, by the way, right? We can see how the theology of Christian nationalism has dire impact. So I'm not trying to minimize the very important work that you and many other scholars do, helping us think about these things in more compassionate and inclusive ways. That's really important. But I know for a fact, a lot of the audience and myself, we get to a point where we say, okay, this is great, but give me like where does the rubber meet the road? Like, where's the tangible outworking of this kind of theology, and what could it lead to? And I kind of want to end on this discussion. You know, how do both of you see open and relational theology, this idea that God is wooing us, is calling us towards love, but God can't make us. God can't force us, right? And God can't control us to do that. And that every day we as a population, we as a species have the choice to move towards love. Obviously, and I'll leave it with this, I'll get your responses. Obviously, the majority of the world does not know what open and relational theology is. They don't care, right? I mean, there's a couple of billion people here. So we need a theology that can be big enough, right, to answer how other people are also moving towards love, even if they don't use the language of the Christian faith or of open and relational theology, etc. So how does open and relational theology kind of give the call or answer that regarding how we move as a human race towards love, justice, and inclusion, even through very diverse paths to get there?
Yeah, I think Jeff and I could take hours on this one. So
you got a minute each. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kind of curious.
I'll focus my response on a contemporary debate in politics that I think a lot of your viewers think matters. And that's the question of whether or not empathy is sin.
Let's go.
If you begin with a God who is not empathetic, who is not relational, who sends down rules in commandments or whatever way that we ought to follow, you're going to have a very non-relational, rule-based religion, whether it's Christianity or something else. That's what it's going to come down, because you think God is the taskmaster, who is the authority, who gives you the rules that you must follow, and if you don't, you go to hell or whatever. If you start with the notion of a God who is relational and empathetic, which means God assesses, evaluates, even feels everything that's happening at all times, and then responds by encouraging us to do what's best given all the circumstances, then this notion of empathy matters a lot to you, not only as you think about God, but as you think about your world, which means there are going to be instances in which Donald Trump says, let's kick your neighbor who's an immigrant back to wherever they came from. And you're going to say to yourself, no, I care about my neighbor. I empathize. Even if the rule says I have to, there's something greater than the rule. And that is the relational love that is expressed by God and that we ought to express to one another. So this view of God makes a real difference in how we think about the rules and empathy debate right now in our country.
Love that. Jeff, what's your thoughts?
I think that Jesus was open and relational.
Oh,
And I think that Jesus's teachings are completely aligned, and we align ourselves with those teachings, right? Including love your enemy, right? So in my congregation, well, I think there's one person who voted for Donald Trump, but everybody else voted for the other side, or voted for somebody else. But and a lot of people don't like Trump, right? Don't like him very strongly. Don't like Christian nationalism. And yet we've been preaching, as a part of the response to his election, we've been preaching a lot about our need to love our enemies. Not just because Jesus said so, but because it's so important if we're going to move toward a better world in which there's less conflict, less hatred, less division, then we can't do that while we also hate our enemies and try to destroy them, right? That's on the individual level as well as the international level. And so I think that's so important, such an important part of what we stand for. So, open relational theology is big and heady sometimes, but I think it really comes down to love, and the love that I believe is inherent in each of us, but too often gets suppressed or damaged or taught out of us by the ways that we're formed.
Okay, I need to respond to this really quick. And Jeff, I'm going to push you a bit here if you don't mind. I know that you and I have talked before, so I know it's all in good faith. But I do wrestle with what you just said, and I'm going to tell you why I do. First off, let me be clear. I totally believe in loving your enemies. Let me just start with that. I mean, Jesus taught it. I'm a Christian. I love when conservative Christians say, oh, Tim, you're a progressive Christian. You're just going by your feelings and what feels good. Give me a teaching in the Bible that you don't want to follow that you do. And I go, yeah, no problem. Loving your enemies, okay? I don't want to do that. However, right, and this is where I do think that we have to call out again that we're all three white men. I think about James Cone, Black liberation theologian, and when he talks about this idea of loving one's enemies and how that manifests maybe differently for a marginalized group who has the boot on their neck, and when is violence okay when the empire does it, but throwing the boot off of your neck, right, is suddenly not okay because it's violent potentially, etc. So I wrestle between what you said, Jeff, like that sounds beautiful. I love that. But there are a lot of people right now, in particular, I'm thinking about my trans neighbors. Donald Trump just signed this executive order that pretty much says if we can get this passed, trans people under 19 will have absolutely no access to any kind of medical care because we're a nation that rejects gender ideology, right? Now, loving one's enemy might look very different in those moments compared to what you just kind of described of like, we don't want to cause chaos or cause more problems. I think there's an obligation for Christians to actually stand in the gap and be a cog in the wheel, so to speak, or a stick in the wheel, in the spoke, to actually stop the machine from causing harm. So in one sense, yes, I mean, I hope that Donald Trump repents, right, and goes the other way, and we would welcome him in if he repented. But there's no sign, given the past almost now decade of Trump, that Trump will ever do that. And so what does loving one's enemies look like in a situation where you're dealing with someone with unprecedented amount of power who is totally ready to use that power to do some major damage to people in our society who have historically already been marginalized? What does love require of us in that moment? I would love to hear your thoughts on this because, frankly, I'm wrestling through it myself. This is very much in real time. I don't have some answer in my back pocket. I would love to hear, as two open and relational theologians, how you answer that question.
Yeah, so I don't mean by that to say that we shouldn't resist the horrible things that our enemies are doing. But as Martin Luther King Jr. often said, hate is not going to solve the problem of hate. Only love is going to do that, right? Hate can't overcome hate. Um, and I think that he lived that, and the civil rights movement practiced that to a large extent. At the same time, there were organizations that were practicing armed self-defense. Even King had guns in his home to protect himself. Uh, uh, but but there were organizations that I think were very important in the civil rights movement to protect nonviolent protesters
Hmm.
from being killed.
Fair.
In fact, I, I had a very interesting experience when I was in college when I went down to a protest in northern Mississippi. It was for economic rights for black people in northern Mississippi. And when we went down there, it was, it was labeled as this was going to be a nonviolent protest. And so it was a very large march. We were marching down the street, and the sheriff's deputies were on one side of us, and the Ku Klux Klan was on the other side of us. And when I got up close to the front of the march, I saw that there was a station wagon leading the march. In the back of the station wagon, there was a pile of shotguns and rifles, just in case.
Wow.
And that's kind of how I see this. I don't believe in absolute nonviolent resistance. I think that sometimes violence is necessary. For example, I've struggled with this back and forth, but I still believe that the Civil War was justified, even though it caused horrific human suffering,
Right.
lots of lives lost. 600,000 people killed during that war. But it ended slavery. It didn't end the oppression of black people in this country, but at least it ended slavery and offered the opportunity to progress in a better direction. So that's how I
Okay.
look at
What are your
it.
thoughts on
But
this,
I
Tom?
still don't. I still think we have to avoid falling into hatred, because
Yeah. Right, because
that's
hatred
going to be
becomes
the end of us.
hatred becomes dehumanization, and dehumanization always puts us on the
Yeah.
path to violence, right? The way that you're able to say we should kill or harm our neighbors by thinking that they're less than human. They're monsters, they're evil, they're witches, they're demons. That language of hatredness will lead anyone to eventually see their fellow human as less than them, and that's what makes that kind of violence so justifiable. Tom, what are your thoughts? I'll give you the last word on
Yeah.
this.
Okay, I think part of the issue that I hear you and Jeff discussing is the question of what love means.
Mm.
I think for many people, love means something like extreme tolerance. Kind of a you do you, I'll do me, we'll just do whatever we want. I'm not going to try to make any judgments on what you do. And I don't think love is about extreme tolerance. I think love is resisting, to use Jeff's language. I think love sometimes looks people who are oppressing in the eye and says, no, I will not follow you. In fact, I think to love Donald Trump is to oppose his presidency. Donald Trump would be better off if he wasn't a president, as well as the
Mm.
rest of the country. So love doesn't mean just kind of go with the flow, let everything just lay as they. It means being active for the well-being of the whole, and that often includes the well-being of those you're actively against. So that's important. I do think, though, there was one word that Jeff said that I didn't agree with, and I wonder if this is the
Oh
word
no, we're
that
gonna fight.
yeah, I wonder if this is the word that triggered you, Tim. Jeff said that when he was talking about his congregation loving your enemy, he used the word division.
Mm.
And I think I know what he meant, but that can come across to some people as saying, hey, I'm not going to oppose my sister across the church aisle, even though she is in favor of Trump's policies. We're just all going to be united in Christ. And I think love sometimes calls for division. And I think Jeff would probably agree with this, that love sometimes says, nope, I can't remain with that group because that group is not doing what I believe God calls us to do. I have to go here. And we can't be on the same team because what you're doing implicates me in the evil I'm opposed to.
Right.
So I'm not so opposed to division as perhaps some people are.
No, I love that. That's really good stuff. Jeff, do you want to respond briefly to that?
I would say both Tom and I have experienced a lot of division in the denominations that we are part of, and you know, a lot of my clergy colleagues and a lot of lay people left the United Methodist Church over the course of the last 50 years because they couldn't stand being in a denomination that seemed so opposed to LGBT inclusion. I specifically stayed to fight against it from within, and Tom was doing the same thing in the Nazarene Church. So it's not that I meant by division. I think that there will always be conflict and division, but if that's what dominates human society, and it's intentionally fostered, that's a problem. So humanity has to get past the idea that we are always in competition with one another. And it goes back to what we were saying before about sort of greed and self-interest. If that continues to be the motivation for humanity, then I don't think we have hope for survival. But if we can get past that, then I think that we can learn to live not only with one another, but live in harmony with the rest of the natural world.
I love that. Well, listen, Jeff and Tom, I appreciate both of you coming on. It means a lot. Let's definitely keep in touch. I think that we're going to have to continue to wrestle with this theology and with how God is moving through the world and what we see in real time. So I appreciate both of you. Tom, I know that you have a public presence. Do you want to share where people can find you and listen to more of what you have to say? Maybe plug some of your books, etc.?
Sure. My personal website is my full name, Thomas J. Oord, and Oord has two O's in it. I've also written a lot of books. Probably the one relevant to our discussion today is simply called Open and Relational Theology, an Introduction to Life-Changing Ideas. But also, Jeff and I were a part of a project called Preaching the Uncontrolling Love of God. And Jeff, why don't you tell them a little bit about that?
There you go.
It's this book. Oh,
there you go.
Yeah, there we go.
So Tom and I and two other pastors put this together, and it came out in April of 2024. And it is a collection of sermons and essays and worship elements to help people in local congregations to bring these ideas into practice in local congregations, in worship, that not just in preaching, but in music, in how we do our prayers, in the liturgies that we write, and so forth. And so I think it's a really amazing resource. It's really the first of its kind that's drawn together such a broad collection of people talking from a lot of different denominational and tradition perspectives. Like 17 different traditions or denominations are represented in this book from across the U.S. and Canada. So,
wow. Love that.
It's a great resource.
Well, thank you both for coming on. It means the world. I really appreciate your time.
Can I share my website as well?
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Jeff. Sorry. Yeah, feel free.
It's jeffreywells.love, spelled JEFFRYWELLS.
Love that. Well, listen, friends, I really appreciate you being here. It means the world. I would love your thoughts on this conversation. I mean, what do you think? Do you agree with Jeff and Tom? Do you think that this idea and notion of God is compatible with what we see in the real world? Do you have thoughts? Do you like what we said? Don't like it? Leave a comment for sure. If you're listening on podcast, we'd love to hear your thoughts. You can email me at podcast@thenewevangelicals.com. We are a nonprofit organization. We do all of this work completely paywall free. So if you want to support the work that we're doing, especially as we walk into the next 4 years, your donations truly are needed more than ever. You can donate via the link in our show notes or in the description below. Don't forget to like this video if you're watching on YouTube. I cannot thank you enough for being here. It is the privilege of my life to do this work full time and show up here consistently on YouTube and podcasts and social media to bring you these kinds of conversations and kind of be with you every step of the way as we navigate the next 4 years. Have a great day. Talk to y'all later.